Hi everybody, thanks so much for having me today. Hi, my name's Tom. You might remember me from such films as Frozen, In Fear, The Joy of Public Speaking. In all seriousness, I work at Akendo. We enable our merchants to capture high-impact customer reviews and user-generated content. We do this either in the standard theme architecture or as well as headless environments. The technology we use are things like the AWS Kitchen Sink, Vue, Node, React, to name a few. But one of my personal projects this year that I've been trying to work on, and ask anyone who knows me, is my serious lack of impulse control. It usually manifests itself where I'm up at night registering to speak at Shopify Unite 2022, and then I have to wake up the next day and go, how am I going to do this thing? And here we are. So it is 2022. Shopper expectations, they're higher than ever before. Merchant expectations even more so. And so as app developers, and as third-party component providers, we have a responsibility to blend seamlessly into these brands that these merchants have so carefully curated. They need to create that brand distinction, and so establishing brand trust through the use of things like user experience, delivering lightning-fast online performance, is what drives conversion and retention today. And at Akendo, I feel like we've found a real sweet spot because we involve the customer in that conversation. So merchants' customers, by leaving reviews that are genuine and honest, fold themselves seamlessly into that customer's brand and form part of the customer's and the merchant's identity together. The customers feel a part of the brand. The merchants feel like their customers build their brand. We recently launched the Akendo Connect platform. So Connect enables Shopify brands to deliver continuous streams of actionable customer data. We achieve this through the use of micro-surveys at peak moments of engagement, and merchants can choose and configure when these surveys appear. We combine this with a single centralized record of customer data, which makes it really easy to manage insights at an individual customer level. And the more data that we work with via integrations and the data provided by surveys and purchase behavior helps foster that relationship. Speaking of integrations, we have over 50 integrations with tech partners that we're really appreciative of. We recently launched Widget Plus. So Widget Plus was a complete rewrite of our on-site widget offering and hosted reviews recorder in Vue. We have 7 main widgets on the site, and depending on merchant need and focus, they can pick widgets to help bolster their brand. Say you're a merchant like a beauty brand, with a user-generated content focus, you can bring something on site like a media grid, which is highly visual and lets them lay out images in responsive ways to highlight that media. If you're someone that believes in that written word forms a really serious part of your brand and that genuine, authentic review is something that's really going to help people and trust your brand, you can have a list-based reviews widget, and that has text more highly featured. Or you can have a combination of both in the form of masonry and card layouts, where you can adjust your sort order to do things like having text first or image first. And it really gives the brands flexibility to use our widgets in a way that they haven't previously been able to. Today, I'm going to talk about star ratings and reviews widgets at Akendo. They're our 2 most popular widgets, and they're pertinent to what we were going on at Hydrogen. Okay, that's the marketing spiel out of the way. We're going to get a little bit nerdy. So what's a reviews widget? What's a star rating? Star rating product detail page usually appears, below the product title, also in product grids and collections and things like that. The reviews widget's usually below the fold. We've got customizable header modules. Was the t-shirt size correct? Did the makeup make my skin oily or dry? Did it work just right? We added sorting and filtering, but on top of all of that, we gave merchants the customization and flexibility they needed to bring this all on site in a really performant way. When we went to rewrite Widget Plus, our previous offering was in vanilla JavaScript. And as developers, we love vanilla JavaScript because we get to impose our views on it and we get to build up something that we love over time, and we hold it close to our chest. It's our baby. So moving to any framework was something that was new, and we had to be careful about what we picked. But we hung our hat on 3 main pillars: accessibility, customization, and performance. We're really, really fortunate at Akendo that we've always considered accessibility as a first-class citizen. We frequently have technical discussions around appropriate use of markup, ali text, aria tags. We translate them all in over 13 different languages as well. We frequently test in screen readers. For Widget Plus, we went one step better. we added in color contrast warnings. So in the admin section, as merchants are configuring their widgets, they can see warnings about the color contrast choices they're making when they're configuring the widget to help open up informed choices for customers that really need it. For performance, Vue is perfect. It allows us to chunk in things on the client and the server. So we get these cacheable chunks. So JavaScript and CSS, you can build up cacheable bundles that are brought in via Webpack over time as and when you need it. We formed a lightweight script, which is placed at the top of the merchant's website. And it detects whether widgets are going to be on site or not. And if they're not, it will exit gracefully. We don't bring any information in that we needed in the form of JavaScript or CSS to render any widgets, because we're not going to use them. We did a faux kind of server-side rendering. We're on site, so we can't control whether we can server-side render on a merchant's website. So what we did was we created a Lambda runner with Puppeteer, where we'd server-side generate the first page of the merchant's reviews widget, and also the JSON blob associated with the data. What we could then do is we could bring that in via Liquid onto the merchant's site or API call, and that would save us a fetch in the initial request. And the really cool thing about that was that we'd store them in meta fields within the Shopify ecosystem, and Shopify gave us sort of that idea, which was fantastic. It gives us better SEO, it gives us perceived performance, and it gives us the above-the-fold CSS bundled and chunked into a single file, and then we trick the Webpack compiler into not loading those chunks in. Here's an example of the Widget Plus visual editor in the admin. The merchants get everything in the kitchen sink. They get responsive testing. They get the header modules, which are sort of those aggregate summary ratings. They can pick 1 to 3 columns. They can scale them as and when needed. So here are some examples of our widgets on site. They're in similar industries, but you can see subtle differences where merchants have sort of highlighted their brand focus in the form of star shapes and things like that. We recently launched custom star shapes. So now you can have not only 5 stars, but 5 hearts or 5 donuts, 5 cactuses, 5 barrels, whatever speaks to your unique brand vision. So as we continue to build out our widget offerings, we sort of have this now centralized kind of view of how we're going to consider where we're going to take widgets next. But we're always going to be considering accessibility, customization, performance. On to hydrogen. This is Scott, sorry he's not quite to scale, did a wonderful job of presenting yesterday about hydrogen, and so I'm going to not repeat what Scott said because he did it better than I ever could. It's a stack for headless e-commerce. It's a Vite plugin and wrapper for React 18. We get streaming server-side rendering, and we get sensible caching policies built in. Shopify have given us these things as developers, and they're things that have been done with really sensible defaults that we can use as developers. The pre-built hooks and components are things that we can leverage and get up and running really fast. Our really big wins at Akendo when using hydrogen was the fact that there was a CLI already there. We were able to run up a demo store and start getting our hands dirty. Developers love digging. We love exploring. There's some new tech, we want to get our hands on it, and we want to shake it down, and we could. It was lightning fast out of the box. And the main hooks that we chose to use were sort of 3 main hooks for a solution that we ended up rolling out. Use shop query, it's a server-only query, GraphQL, and the storefront API. Fetch sync is your standard fetch. You'd use it for querying things like a public API. So in our case, the Akendo public API. Use query is similar, again, allows that fetch kind of operation, but like Scott was talking about yesterday with the benefits of React 18 and suspense, what that lets you do is load it in and use suspense at the same time. And I'll talk in a little bit about GraphQL fragments. So a little bit more marketing spiel, but now we're really going to get dirty. So anyone who likes code samples, this is for you. So we had a mission. We were given a mission. About 6 months, we were following Hydrogen's development with keen interest in that lead up to its launch. We were getting really excited. And we'd heard murmurings of an ad agency and Shopify React devs working together in unison to achieve something pretty amazing, which was this flagship Hydrogen store for Hydrogen's launch. So for the purposes of this presentation, the merchant's name rhymes with PIMS, and they're headed up by the infamous Shmim Shmardashian. And while we at Akendo were watching our company mandated, contractually obligated hour of keeping up with the Schmardashians every evening and working out who was dating who and yelling, "Oh no, he didn't," in camaraderie, the team at Hydrogen and their developers were building an incredible thing. So we got a call from Schmim's Peoples about 6 weeks before launch. "Hi, Akendo. I'm an existing Akendo merchant, and I'd really love you to port your widget offering over to Hydrogen. You've got 3 weeks to show us that you can do it, and if you achieve it within 3 weeks, this proof of competence, you've got 3 more weeks to polish it and make sure it's production and ready." So the mission objectives were pretty hardcore. There was no to low impact to page speed. Everyone wants something fast. There were no API calls from third-party developer and in the client where possible. And it had to be Hydrogen best practice. So talking to other app developers, Hydrogen best practice hadn't really been defined. So people were exploring rolling up APIs in server-side components and sending them out, and that was Hydrogen. And so we felt like we had this meteor coming towards us, and we did what all developers do best. We panic, we plan, we start coding, and we repeat. So we formed a team of 3 crack developers. We had Suzanne with a special attack of like an influence cookie purchase to keep us like sugar levels high. We had 3 weeks, we had to get it done. We had Rowan, who works so fast and digs so quickly that his special attack is an instant merge conflict, and it's so quick it's usually with himself. And for myself, I just was downing a lot of Dr. Pepper and trying to motivate them and learn at the same time. So they're the real heroes of this story. So the first thing we had to do in this relatively unknown technology that we'd tinkered around with was work out how, as developers, do we think in Hydrogen? How do they want us to do things? And being open source, we could dig up stupid. We could dig in, get our hands dirty. So we set ourselves 4 main tasks. We wanted to retrieve the merchant's on-site configuration. So everything that comes down from the admin section that displays style and first pages and all of that kind of thing. We wanted to render those above the fold CSS bundles. We wanted to work out how then to display a star rating because it's the simpler of the 2 widgets. We then wanted to work out, can we display a reviews widget? And lastly, we wanted to roll it all up. So we had to create pretty clear boundaries, and we did a lot of reading of the online dev documentation, a lot of reading of the source code. We had to think about server, client, build, release. So on the server, we were thinking about, okay, it's a natural with this no API calls requirement on the client, we're going to lean towards React server components. And in that, we could call out the storefront API, we could call out our Akendo public API. The reason I've got shared utils between server and client was, as I'll explain later, we discovered that you had to have boundaries between shared utils. Because if, for example, you brought in a server-based util into the client, you'd inadvertently crash something because it would have unnecessary server dependencies that the client didn't know how to deal with. For build and release, we're a Webpack family, mainly at Akendo, so Vite was new, so everything was new, and I've got a short time frame. We wanted to be a good first-class citizen. We wanted to roll out CJS and ESM because we weren't sure at the time how our third-party component library, all rolled up, published on NPM or Yarn, would be consumed, and how Hydrogen wanted it to be consumed. So we started with this idea of Akendo provider server.tsx. It was supposed to be like high up in the component tree, the React component tree, as an entry point to our application or our integration. So the first thing for retrieving the merchant's settings and their JSON was we could use fetch sync. It's hitting a public API. That's what Shopify wants us to do. And we could do it with a really sensible cache default. So we called it, fetching, or in this case, claw machining our main parts of our configuration. And we were really hopeful that fetch sync would kind of have a better success rate than going to time zone and throwing $10 in and getting stuffed Hydrogen man out. And it did. It performed really well. So if that was successful, we'd then get our view entry point JavaScript. So that's hitting again a CDN and pulling down our JavaScript. Instead of pulling down like the file path, what we actually did was we used fetch sync with a short cache which Shopify gave us for free in Hydrogen and a bit of a preload. And then we inlined that JavaScript into the merchant's head. So that saves us another network call. If there were any error conditions in this first initial setup, we had a hook there called useRequestContext. It didn't actually exist at the time, so I'll explain it as a special case shortly. Once we had our configuration, we could then retrieve our above-the-fold pre-rendered CSS. This was slightly different. It wasn't your standard fetch sync. It's a use shop query because we're going to use metafields GraphQL to let the merchant retrieve metafields out of the Shopify store, which have our bundled CSS, and then display it on site. We'd output this then in the head and the body as needed. Here's a sample implementation of how we kind of rolled that out. So you've got your head, that's a helmet wrapper in React. And then you've got, as you can see, the Akendo provider there, just before the Shopify provider, where we're passing in the Akendo merchant subscriber ID. Prerequisites for using the third-party component library were we needed to have permissions on the storefront API, and then we also needed to have metafielded permissions as well. So I promised you I'd talk to you about the request context and error state and what that all meant. So we needed a way to be able to go, well, if something in that initial configuration fails, how are we going to notify our components below? We don't want to unnecessarily perform any more server or client calls or anything like that lower down the React tree if something's failed at the top. So we went digging through the source and we found this request.ctx, which was using a Shopify hook called useServerRequest. We thought we could wrap our tentacles around it, sort of hijack it, and stick our Akendo sticker on the box and send it down the request pipeline. So the way we did this was, we had to make a few assumptions. This request in source code, request.ctx, was actually a plain JavaScript object. So we thought maybe we can append our error state to this plain JavaScript object and have it fall down the tree. We assumed that it could be passed in through appserver.jsx, which seemed okay. And we had to make the assumption that it was actually a plain JavaScript object, and that would persist throughout the whole server rendering lifecycle. And then we also had to assume that we could pass it in as props to our third-party component provider. So we proposed an interim solution, and we posted it up on GitHub to the Shopify Hydrogen team. And it was very simple, because all we're doing is essentially adding a property to a plain JavaScript object, and then retrieving it. And if it doesn't exist, we create it and hope that it sends it down. And we found in initial testing it did. So we then sort of showed the Hydrogen dev team, look, this is a bit of a proposed implementation of how it might then be consumed. We heard back from Shopify's Hydrogen dev team like 48 hours later, and they'd done us one better. They actually rolled up a whole new hook for any third-party component library. It was called useRequestContext. Hashtag love the Hydrogen dev team. Thanks so much, Fran, Josh, and Brett. You guys were absolute legends. So they'd implemented useRequestContext, and what's more, they'd actually documented it as well. It was very similar to the implementation that we'd suggested, except they'd done us one better by adding scope. So they added like a namespace kind of scope so that if other merchants were going to roll up their own third-party component libraries for Hydrogen, they can provide their own scope, and they wanted you to prefix it with something like your company name. And because it's a plain JavaScript object, you don't want to be stomping on someone else's scope. So now we had our configuration. We'd satisfied point one. We could retrieve our merchant configuration, we could get it into the head, and we were ready to start tinkering with our server components. So we found for both the reviews widget and the star rating, the process was pretty similar. We'd check if the initialization had succeeded by using useRequestContext. Is there an error? If there is, we exit out gracefully. But then we have a fallback, and we can then provide a client version of that component and hydrate in if needed. So we could then validate our props, and then we could use shopquery to pull down the metafields that are associated with the markup for that component, as well as saving us that first page of rendering and fetch. Again, we used shopquery with a standard preload that was given to us with the metafields GraphQL. We then passed that down into a generic Okendo widget client component. But because this was being called in a server component, it's actually rendered server-side, but it's also a fallback in a way. And then when it finishes rendering and it's finally down in the client, you can use the standard React use effect to call our JavaScript window API to then hydrate the client-side interactivity. So that leads me on, we had to provide client components. We weren't sure how our merchants would be consuming our third-party component library, and some might need to use it on the client. There's a bit of a rule, and it's documented really well on the Shopify dev website when you're looking into Hydrogen, where a server component can create a client component, and a client component can't create a server component. but it can have it fed to it through pass-through props. And as long as you adhere to those rules, it's pretty straightforward, actually, and it works really well, as expected. So in providing client components, we had to create a clear boundary between server and client in our VS Code files. So first things, package JSON exports. We had to provide a clear client export so that then third-party people consuming our third-party component library would be able to grab that client folder or that client export and clearly know, hey, that's their client boundary. And it kind of created a clear boundary as we find soon. The markup in the project was, still needs a little bit of work, but we think we did enough to kind of help people initially understand the boundary. So we had our configuration, our server components, and we had our client components ready to go. We had to work out how to Vite them up. So we rolled everything up, we established a pretty standard Vite configuration. We went to launch it, and we failed. We've got a few weeks left, we're freaking out, and that day, let's just say Shmim had a really bad headache. And if Shmim's having a bad headache, we're having a bad headache. So the main problem was that there was a configuration issue between Webpack. Webpack outputs, we were being a good first-class citizen. We were outputting CJS and ESM. The Vite config, though, specifically the way it handles plugins, is being consumed as CJS. And the Hydrogen app, which was a peer dependency to our app, hang on a second, more CJS, ESM, was being expected to be consumed in ESM. What we actually found was it was React HTML parser. We were using it as a peer dependency to try and clear up our head. As we were going to inject our styles into the head, we didn't want to have unnecessary wrapper elements. We then found React HTML parser was being a good first-class citizen. It was being provided out of CJS and ESM. But there was something in the way that Vite 2 was handling that import and that peer dependency that meant that it wasn't actually respecting its exports. So we came up with this sort of idea we could add it as a rule in optimized depths, which tells Vite to pre-bundle React HTML parser in the right way. It wasn't a great solution because it would mean merchants would have to do that, and we'd have to instruct their developers to do that, and we didn't want them to worry about our peer dependencies. So a better solution was to provide the Vite plugin that adds the optimized dependencies in a config hook. And so they could essentially provide Akendo as a plugin. And it was easier than telling end users how to modify it. So we had DevStore deploy success. We had a local prod deploy success. But a week later and a few Hydrogen releases later, we suddenly had a window as not defined. And it was because React HTML parser was actually bringing in window as a reference, and we were trying to use it in a server component. Window doesn't exist on a server, so it didn't know how to process that, and it blew up. So we took out our laser gun, and in retaliation, we blew React HTML parser away and launched without it. So we thought we were ready to go again. We got to a closer planet, but again, we failed, and this time it was a real fiery kind of failure. So we had fully functioning server components with our stars rating and our reviews widget. We'd nearly finished these client components. The demo store approach, though, had changed significantly, and I think ultimately for the better. Shopify had dropped a huge release of a reworked demo store, which resulted in sort of this new approach where there would be this emphasis on this upfront querying. So they would be retrieving the bulk of the data that they needed from the server and passing it down into a mix of server and client components, and I think that was a really clean way to do it. And I really hope that persists. So, we designed Shmim a new rocket. We trashed the first two. We added a brand logo on the back and a few diamantes, and she thought it was looking pretty good. But we needed to kind of close that loop. We had to provide a way for people consuming our library to be able to retrieve server-side data as and when they needed it. And we did it in the form of exposing a GraphQL fragment that they could append. A use case for it would be something like in a product card component or a recommended products component. So they can then use our GraphQL fragment, which is very straightforward. It's a very simple GraphQL fragment. But they can use that to then pull back the metafield data they need to then be able to display the component as and when they need it. So the outcome, if you can see it okay, we had Shmim's website launch with no server-side queries in the XHR call. We'd really hoped she'd designed us some, mirror-shaped diamante shapewear I could wear today, but unfortunately, she just couldn't ship it in time. States, Australia, shipping's a bit crap. But our key takeaways: structure your boundaries. If you're going to plan to do something in Hydrogen as a third-party component provider or as an app developer, take the time to plan and have a look at where your boundaries might live between your server and your client components. When in doubt, you can use shared components, which are a bit of a mix of both. Providers like use request context can be really powerful, but as Shopify have documented, pass-through props should generally be a priority. But if you don't know where in the component tree something's going to sit, use request context can provide that state that your child components need. Beware of third-party libraries and their peer dependencies. With Vite being in Vite 2, we still do have that issue, but they're moving towards Vite 3 in the next release of Hydrogen, so it's really exciting because we're hoping that'll resolve that issue. Whenever in doubt, dig. Hydrogen's open source, and as developers, that's really exciting because we can work out how to extend and use it. It's flexible, it's fast, and it's a game changer, so get started today. I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Shopify for having me. This has been fantastic, and I appreciate it so much. You guys have been so welcoming. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Who did the graphics for this deck?
I did.
Good work, man.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a bit of fun.
Very good.
Thanks, guys. Cool. Any others? Cool. Thank you very much.